initiated all sorts of other devices to accelerate industrial development. And the now independent republic also attempted to gain a monopoly of cotton. Came pretty close. The reasons were stated explicitly. The reasons were to place all other nations at our feet, particularly the British enemy, which was militarily more powerful in those days, but could be brought to the feet of the United States if the U.S. monopolized the cotton, which is crucial for their early industrial development. Those were the Jacksonian presidents, their announcement when they conquered Texas and half of Mexico. But notice that the U.S. policies in the mid-19th century were essentially those that were attributed to Saddam Hussein. There were wild claims that he was trying to control the energy resources of the Middle East and bring the rest of the world to his feet. Well, that was a fantasy, but it wasn't a fantasy when the U.S. carried out those policies in the mid-19th century. It's one of the ways it became the most powerful, richest country in history. Well, for Egypt, there wasn't any comparable course because it was barred by British power. Lord Palmerston declared that no ideas of fairness toward Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as preserving its economic and political hegemony. He expressed what he called his hate for the ignorant barbarian Muhammad Ali, kind of developmental leader of Egypt who dared to seek an independent course. He deployed Britain's fleet, major military force of the 19th century, and British financial power, which is also overwhelming, to terminate Egypt's quest for independence and economic development. And so it continued. After World War II, when the United States displaced Britain as global hegemon, Washington adopted the same stand. Washington made it clear to the Egyptians that it would provide no aid unless Egypt adhered to the standard rules, the rules for the weak, that is. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to violate them, for example, by imposing high tariffs on to bar Egyptian cotton. That's the usual interpretation of market principles. They're fine for the weak, but not for the strong, at home as well. That's why maybe a quarter of the U.S. population is now qualifying for food stamps, while the bankers are providing themselves with enormous bonuses. Those are market principles. In Adam Smith's defense, I should say that he recognized what would happen if Britain followed the rules of sound economics. And now it's called neoliberalism. It's not very different. He warned that if British manufacturers, merchants, and investors turned abroad, they might profit, but England would suffer. But he felt that that wouldn't happen because they would be guided by what's called a home bias. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared the ravages of economic rationality. Actually, that passage in Wealth of Nations is pretty hard to miss. It's the only time that the phrase invisible hand appears in the book, namely in an argument against what we now call neoliberalism. That's the one occurrence of the famous phrase. The other leading founder of classical economics, David Ricardo, he drew similar conclusions. He hoped that the home bias, quote him now, would lead men of property to be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country rather than to seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations. Feelings, he said, that I would be sorry to see weakened. Put aside their predictions, but the instincts of the classical economists were sound and significant and conformed to economic history. The democracy uprising in the Arab world is sometimes compared to Eastern Europe in 1989, but on very dubious grounds. In 1989, the democracy uprising was tolerated by the Russians. And of course it was supported by Western power in accord with the standard doctrine that democracy is okay if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. So it's fine in Eastern Europe where it's breaking up the global enemy, but not in Central America at the same time, where it's being crushed by violence. There's no Gorbachev in the West today. On the contrary, Western power remains very hostile to democracy in the Arab world for quite good reasons, those I mentioned. There are actually more apt comparisons between what's happening today and developments in the past, but I could talk about them later if you like, but I'll put them aside now for reasons of time. Well, coming to the present, grand area doctrines, pretty much in the way they were expressed back in the Second World War, they continue to apply to contemporary crises and confrontations. So take what's called in Western policy-making circles and in political commentary, it's taken for granted that the major threat to world order today is what's called the Iranian threat. In fact, this is called the Year of Iran, and therefore it has to be the major focus of U.S. foreign policy, with Europe trailing along politely, as it tends to do. So we might ask ourselves exactly what is the Iranian threat? In fact, you might look and see how often it's discussed. I mean, it's also always brought up, but exactly what is it? What's the Iranian threat? Well, we actually have an authoritative answer to that question. It was provided by the Pentagon and by U.S. intelligence services. Every year they give an annual report to Congress on global security. The most recent one, a couple of months ago, they, of course, had a section on the Iranian threat. And what they say is that the Iranian threat is not military. Quote, I'll quote, Iran's military spending is relatively low compared to the rest of the region. Its military doctrine is strictly defensive, designed to slow an invasion and force an invasion of Iran, and to force a diplomatic solution to hostilities. Iran has only a limited capability to project force beyond its borders. Its military spending is a fraction of Saudi Arabia, of course, incomparably less than the United States or its allies. And according to General Petraeus, the head of the U.S. Central Command, the Iranian Air Force could be taken out almost instantly by the Air Force of Qatar. Forget the rest. So that's the military threat. With regard to the nuclear option, they say, Pentagon Intelligence, Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. Okay? Those are all quotes. The clerical regime, brutal clerical regime, it's doubtless a threat to its own people, but it hardly outranks U.S. allies in that regard. That can't be the problem. The threat lies elsewhere, and it's ominous. And the reports say, yes, it's ominous. One element of the threat is Iran's potential deterrent capacity. That's an illegitimate exercise of sovereignty that might interfere with U.S. freedom of action in the region. It's glaringly obvious why Iran would seek a deterrent capacity. Just take a look at the disposition of military bases and nuclear forces in the region. And actually that's been recognized 7 years ago. Israel's one of the leading military historians in Israel, Martin von Crefeld, wrote that, it was right after the invasion of Iraq, the world has witnessed how the United States attacked Iraq for, as it turned out, no reason at all. Had the Iranians not tried to build nuclear weapons, they would be crazy. His words. particularly when they're under constant threat of attack by the U.S., incidentally in violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares about minor technicalities. Whether they are developing nuclear weapons, actually no one knows, but maybe they are. If so, it would certainly be understandable as long as they're under constant threat. However, Iran's threat, the reports continue, Pentagon intelligence, they go beyond deterrence. Iran is also trying to expand its influence in neighboring countries. The Pentagon and the intelligence services report. That is, they're trying to destabilize the region. It's an interesting term, actually. Those are the technical terms of foreign policy discourse. Notice when the U.S. invades and occupies Iran's neighbors, that's stabilization. Iran's efforts to extend its influence to them is destabilization, hence plainly illegitimate. That's routine usage. Just to give one striking example, a very prominent foreign policy analyst, James Chase, he was properly using the term stability in the technical sense when he explained, quoting him, that to achieve stability in Chile in 1973, it was necessary to destabilize the country, namely by overthrowing the elected government and installing a vicious dictatorship. That's the right usage. Other concerns about Iran are equally interesting to explore, but perhaps that's enough to reveal the guiding principles and their status in imperial culture. As to again go back to grand area planning, President Roosevelt's planners emphasized at the dawn of the contemporary world system that the U.S. cannot tolerate any exercise of sovereignty that interferes with its global designs. That's what it means to own the world and to rule it. The United States and Europe are united in punishing Iran for its threat to stability, but it's useful to recall how isolated they are. They're referred to as the international community, but remember that has a technical meaning too. The international community means the United States by definition, and anyone who happens to agree with it at the moment. That's the international community. Everyone else is kind of like Arabs in their opinion. So what about the non-people? Well, the non-aligned countries, that's the majority of the world's population, they have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium all the way through. Within the region, as I mentioned, Arab public opinion not only supports their right to carry out uranium enrichment, but quite strongly favors Iranian nuclear weapons. The major regional power, Turkey, voted against the latest U.S.-initiated sanctions motion in the Security Council, along with Brazil, which is the most admired country of the South. In fact, Europe and the United States are extremely isolated on this. They are the international community by definition, but by other standards, they're very isolated. The disobedience of Turkey and Brazil led to sharp censure, not for the first time. Turkey had been bitterly condemned in 2003 when the government followed the will of 95% of the population and refused to participate in the invasion of Iraq. That demonstrated their very weak grasp of democracy in the Western sense. And they were punished by the U.S. for that and charged in a very hostile commentary. Same after their refusal to support the U.S. sanctions proposal in 2010. Turkey was warned by Obama's top diplomat on European affairs that it must demonstrate its commitment to partnership with the West. A scholar in the Council on Foreign Relations asked, how do we keep the Turks in their lane where they're supposed to be, acting like good democrats?